Welcome to this overview of the vRealize Operations user interface. In this section, we're going to cover the basics of the vRealize Operations UI, as well as provide you with a tour of the main components of vRealize Operations and how to navigate through it. We'll also show you how you can find help in case you get stuck. While the vRealize Operations UI is rather intuitive, it's still important to cover this section and be familiar with how to navigate through the UI in order to provide better demonstrations and proof of concepts and instill confidence in our customers and show them how easy the product is to use. Now, when you first log into vRealize Operations, this is what you will see. This is the quick start page. And this page is split up into several different pieces. On the left side of the page is the navigation menu. So this is how we can quickly access the most important features of vRealize Operations. In the center of the screen, we have vRealize Operations broken down into the four main use cases that we talked about in section 1. So in this first section are the key performance optimization features, and you'll notice at the top that vRealize Operations is telling us how many data centers could benefit from these features. So looking at things like workload optimization, which allows us to look at where all of our different virtual machines are running and make sure that, first of all, things are balanced appropriately across the entire environment. But then also looking at things like compliance and making sure that virtual machines are running where they need to be running, where they're supposed to be. And then there's right sizing, which allows us to look at the capacity across all of our data centers, and within each of those, identify if there are oversized virtual machines, if we are wasting resources with a virtual machine that has 4 vCPUs and 16 gigs of memory, when it really needs half of that. Or on the other hand, looking at undersized virtual machines. So do we have virtual machines that are just consistently running hot and don't have enough resources to serve their applications? Recommended Actions allows you to look across the entire environment that's being monitored by vRealize Operations and look for opportunities to improve performance and address any critical issues. So for example, we can look across our clusters and see if there are any clusters that have high CPU workload, or maybe there's some contention. Look at host systems and see if there's any configuration issues, or maybe there's some networking issues with our hosts. And virtual machines too. We can look to see if there are any virtual machines that have drives that are filling up. And the optimization history, again, allows you to look across the entire environment and identify if there are data centers that might be good candidates for workload optimization. We can also look at capacity savings, so how much money could we potentially reclaim from virtual machines, as well as look at how virtual machines have been moving around the environment, whether it's distributed resource scheduler that is moving virtual machines within a cluster, or if it's workload optimization, which is moving virtual machines across clusters. Now, you've probably also noticed that the left-hand navigation menu loosely mimics what's available under Quick Start. So there is also a performance optimization section here with several of the key features that are available within the Quick Start Optimized Performance section. The next pillar is the Optimized Capacity pillar, and right at the top here is something that's going to be hard for customers to ignore, because vRealize Operations is showing us how much money per month we could be saving by reclaiming idle virtual machines, cleaning up snapshots, orphan disks, reclaiming resources from oversized virtual machines, and deleting powered off virtual machines. And these are all things that are covered within the Optimized Capacity pillar. The first feature here is really a good starting point for capacity optimization, and this is the capacity assessment. So obviously it's important that we know what our environment looks like, and this lets us look across all of our data centers to identify if there are clusters within them that are either running out of capacity or are already out of capacity. We can then dive deeper into the clusters and take a look at CPU, memory, or disk space to help us to determine whether it makes more sense to reclaim or right size, or migrate, or maybe even purchase new hardware and grow the cluster. And once we have a handle on our capacity, then we can dive into reclamation. Now, this is a feature you'll definitely want to show your customers because this is vRealize Operations paying for itself. This lets us look across all of our data centers and identify per data center how much money we can save. And this is a monthly savings as well, so this isn't just a one-time thing. We can dive into the data centers and look at how many powered off virtual machines there are, how many idle VMs, snapshots, are there orphan disks, and we can also break it down by how much money per month we can save by deleting these powered off VMs or removing snapshots. These are all very easy activities, and it's actually made even easier through vRealize operations because we can do it within the product UI. We don't have to jump out to vCenter or any other tool to, perform these actions. We can do it all within the UI. Best of all, we can either perform it now or we can perform these actions on a schedule and maybe even just do recurring schedules to say, hey, clean up all of my snapshots every Sunday. Next is the capacity planning, or the what-if planning within vRealize operations. And this is an extremely powerful feature because it lets us model various actions, whether we were to add or remove virtual machines from a cluster, or add or remove hosts from a cluster. What if it's a standard traditional cluster that uses SAN storage, or if it's a hyperconverged cluster using vSAN? What about your customers that want to migrate to the hybrid cloud or to the public cloud? vRealize Operations lets them model those scenarios as well and look across multiple cloud providers to make sure that you're picking the best one for your organization. And even for private clouds, we can assess the costs of our various data centers and make sure that our applications and our workloads are running in the data centers that make the most sense financially for us to run them. The cost assessment allows us to look across the entire environment and see what it actually costs to run everything. We can break things down by data center and look at the cost per data center. How many VMs and hosts and clusters are within that data center, and how much does it cost for storage for all of that? We can then break things down by the clusters and look at what is our most expensive cluster compared to our least expensive clusters. So really just helps us to get an understanding and a handle on the business side of things and be able to make informed decisions based on real actual data. And those actions are spelled out in business terms under the cost optimization feature. So how much money could we be saving if we just deleted idle virtual machines or powered off VMs? This also provides a great breakdown of our realized savings. So for the past month, how much money have we actually saved the business by, right-sizing oversized virtual machines or deleting snapshots? And of course, it's not all just about cost savings, but also saving applications and making sure that things are running correctly. So this shows us how much it would cost per month to right-size our undersized virtual machines. So this is another feature that we definitely want to be showing customers. Now, the next great thing that vRealize Operations can do is help customers to troubleshoot much faster, and that's our next pillar. And right at the top here is the troubleshooting workbench. Now, we're going to get a lot deeper into all of this a little bit later on. But in summary, the troubleshooting workbench allows us to take a look at an object, say a virtual machine, and identify if there are any sort of anomalies or property changes with that virtual machine or any of its peers. We can look at the host that it's running on, the cluster, maybe even the OS that is running on that virtual machine or the applications. This feature is a real time saver. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of clicks to go through and look at all the metrics for a virtual machine, let alone look at the host that it's running on or the cluster or any of the child objects like applications or OSs, right? For any of us that have done these activities, it usually requires many, many browser tabs or notepad instances or Excel spreadsheets, right? Troubleshooting Workbench is going to identify all of the interesting information and bubble that up to your customer's attention without having to do all of that and help them to land on a root cause much faster. And what good are collecting all these metrics without alerts, right? Obviously, we want to know when something happens, something important happens. So the alerts feature here will take you into the alerts view within vRealize Operations to take a look at triggered alerts. And metrics and alerts can sometimes just be half of the picture. Sometimes we need to know who made these changes, and that's where logs come in. So vRealize Operations has very tight integration with vRealize Log Insight, and we can actually launch vRealize Log Insight within vRealize Operations here. And say we're looking at an ESXi host, we can actually jump right to that host's logs within vRealize Operations. It's a fantastic integration, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And lastly are the various troubleshooting dashboards. So these will take you through the key metrics for all the various objects that you see here, virtual machines, hosts, clusters, to again help customers to identify what might be causing these issues. Now, these are static dashboards, so it's a little bit different than the troubleshooting workbench, but they're also there as a good helpful tool. And last but definitely not least is the configuration management pillar. This is where we can find our compliance feature, which allows us to analyze the configuration of our hosts and of our virtual machines and make sure that they adhere to various compliance standards, whether it's the vSphere security configuration guides or if it's a regulatory compliance standard like HIPAA, DISA, FISMA, ISO, PCI, or CIS, right? Any of these US-based regulatory standards. Customers can also create their own compliance benchmarks. So if they have any sort of corporate configuration that they must adhere to, they can create those as well. And once these standards are either created or enabled, vRealize operations will just keep a constant eye on the configuration of all of your relevant items, so your hosts or your virtual machines, and make sure that they're still within compliance. And if they're not, let you know that there's work to be done. And then the configuration dashboards let us look across all of our virtual machines and identify if there are versions of VMware tools that are out of date or how many different versions of VMware tools are out there. Right? These things are important for things like upgrades. Same goes for hosts too. We can see all the different models that are out there and different versions of ESXi that are installed, even BIOS versions, right? Again, things that are all very important for upgrading, right? We want to make sure that when we go to upgrade that everything is configured consistently and that we don't have any sort of problems along the way. This can also help to identify if there is CPU hot add or memory hot add enabled, because this could impact the performance of our virtual machines. If we have any hosts that have SSH enabled, right, that could be a security loophole that could be exploited, or even configuration things like hyperthreading, right? We want to make sure that everything is consistent, whether we do want hyperthreading or if we don't want hyperthreading. So again, really just get a good handle on everything across the environment. Now, across the top of vRealize operations are our main navigation links. So, of course, we are on the home screen here, but if we want to go into the dashboards or if we want to look at alerts, right, those are all available there. The environment tab allows us to explore all of the objects that are being monitored by vRealize operations, whether it's a vSphere object like a VM, or maybe it's an application, or maybe it's a Kubernetes cluster or a public cloud service, right? All of these are available for navigation within the environment tab, and we'll take a closer look at this in just a minute. The administration tab is where we go to configure everything for vRealize operations. So starting with making those connections to your vSphere environments or to your public cloud services, Kubernetes clusters, whatever it is, that's all within the administration tab. We can also configure policies as well. So how do we want vRealize operations to look and feel and operate and, calculate and all of these sorts of things? That's all within policy, and those go very deep. And I urge you to spend some time and get familiar with the administration tab and all the various things that are available within there. I mean, we talked about cost savings and all of those sorts of things, right? Well, the cost driver database can be configured within here as well to be able to put in the actual cost of your servers and your labor and facilities and electricity and all that sort of stuff. So there's really just a lot more in here than we're going to be able to cover in this session. Now, if you don't want to go through the environment tab and navigate to a specific object, you can always use the magnifying glass here to search for it. So there is autocomplete in here. You just simply start typing out the name of the object, whether it's a virtual machine or distributed switch or NSX, component, anything like that. Type it in here. vRealize operations will start making suggestions based on what you typed, so you can quickly find that specific object. And taking a look at the last two items on the left-hand navigation menu, we have all of the application-based features. So our service discovery, which means we can go out and see what's running on our virtual machines and get some basic information from those services. And then there's also the full application monitoring. So this is using the Telegraph agent to actually pull metrics from the guest operating system and from the various applications that may be installed on our virtual machine. machine. So those are here on the left-hand menu. And then finally, the Automation Central. So we talked about performing reclamation activities on a schedule. Again, whether it's a one-time thing or if it's a recurring thing, well, that's all handled through Automation Central. And so you can get to that from here as well. And let's not forget the View More button down at the bottom here. There are some very important features that you'll want to go through with your customers, like the Cloud Management Assessment. On the left here under Extend Monitoring, these are a couple management packs we can install to look at the health of our software-defined data center objects. And there's also the vRealize Operations Aggregator. So this allows us to connect to multiple vRealize Operations instances and view all those metrics from within a single aggregator instance. That management pack is linked right there. If you are looking for more information about vRealize Operations, well, there are links to a guided tour page and some additional learning for you to check out. And then finally, on the right-hand side here, this is where we go to run the Cloud Management Assessment, which we're going to cover in depth in a later module. Now, if your customers are really excited to get underway in using vRealize Operations and you're not available, well, they can check out the guided tours available within vRealize Operations Cloud. So this is not available in the on-premises deployment of vRealize Operations. However, if your customers are running vRealize Operations Cloud, or if they're doing a trial or a POC, check out the guided tours, because this will take them step by step through various activities. So just connecting vRealize Operations to vSphere, or creating dashboards or reports, or troubleshooting objects. This is a great way for customers who are not familiar with the product to get familiar with these key features. Okay, and under the Dashboards tab, the first page that we're going to see is the Getting Started screen. And what this does is it really breaks down all of the dashboards. I mean, there's tons of dashboards within vRealize Operations. And so these are all broken down by various use cases. So for example, if we want to look at managing our environments, we can look at capacity, cost dashboards. There's dashboards that are based on workflows. So troubleshooting is a perfect example here, right? It takes many steps to get from an issue to the root cause. And there are dashboards for specific scenarios too. So if we're looking at, say, contention, right? If we are starving our virtual machines for resources, we can look at utilization or even configuration, right? So there's a bunch of dashboards within there. So again, all of these are really related to workflow type of activities. And then down below are some of our dashboard collections. So if we're looking at things like hybrid cloud, well, here's all of our dashboards for that. If you're looking at public cloud, right, all of the various services and dashboards related to those, well, those are available there as well. And of course, one of the great things about vRealize Operations is that it's fully customizable. So we can go out and we can create our own dashboards and we can export those. Well, we have a full community of people who create custom dashboards and share them on the sample exchange. So by clicking on the More Dashboard Samples button here, your customers will get to the sample exchange where they can download custom dashboards that were created by the community and import those into their own vRealize Operations. So before you head out and start creating your own dashboard, as fun as it can be, might be a great idea to check out the sample exchange first, because maybe somebody's already created it. I mean, there's several hundred dashboard examples that are out there, and they're all free. And on the left-hand side is where we can access all of the content within vRealize Operations. So whether it's dashboards, views, or reports, all of these have this folder type of structure to be able to navigate to whatever content we're looking for. We can also do a search if we know that, we want a dashboard for virtual machines, right? We can type in VM in the search and vRealize Operations will return all the dashboards or views, or again, even reports that have the name VM in them. And if you need help with vRealize Operations on premises, there is this question mark available throughout the product. And this will take you to the related documentation to whatever feature it is that you're looking for. So if you get stuck, you can click on this question mark here. And for those customers that are running vRealize Operations Cloud, they can get help by clicking the question mark here on the top banner. Now, there are some different features here, such as help topics, so descriptions of various features like troubleshooting. There's also links to the related documentation pages, so depending upon where you are on the product, these will all change. If your customers want to chat directly with VMware support, that option is available here. They can also manage their support requests or post a question to the VMware community forums. All right, and moving across the top here, our next tab is Alerts, which, you guessed it, is where you go to view all of the alerts within vRealize operations. So in the main window here, we can see all of the alerts, and these alerts are grouped by various criteria. So in this case, we actually have it grouped by scope. And what that means is that we can then view all of the alerts for all of the objects within a single cluster, within a single ESXi host, right? We can really group things together based on whatever sort of scoping criteria that we have. We can also group all of the alerts based on the time that they were triggered. So this could be really good for trying to understand, what happened in the environment, say within the last hour, right? We'll see all of the alerts that were triggered in that time and can really kind of help us to build a story while troubleshooting. Or we can group it based on object too. If I just want to see all of my virtual machine alerts grouped together compared to maybe my Kubernetes alerts, right? Have those grouped together in a separate group. We can also create filters for specific alert types or objects or alert statuses and things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility of what we can do as far as visualizing the alerts that are within vRealize operations. And of course, down here, obviously, is where we view the alerts. Now, there's a ton of information that we can gather in this view here, but I'm not going to go in depth at this point because we are going to cover this in the next section. Now over here on the left is where we can go to obviously view all of our triggered alerts. So it's broken down by viewing all of the alerts. And then there's the administrative option. So this is showing any alerts related to vRealize operations. So for example, if there's a collector that's not able to connect with whatever endpoint it is to collect metrics and properties and information, right? That's the type of alerts that you'll see under the administrative option here. Then, of course, this is where we would go to create alerts or edit alerts, right? So we can look at the alert definitions and symptoms and recommendations and actions and notifications, payload templates, right? All of these things are available on the left-hand side. Again, not going to get into that right now because we are going to cover this in the next section, but just want you to know where everything is found. And finally, the Environment tab is where we go to view all of the objects within vRealize operations. And across the top here, we have a number of options for grouping objects together. So there's custom groups, which could really be any number of objects that are just grouped together. So if it's virtual machines grouped with public cloud services, you can absolutely do that. And custom groups come in handy, especially when we're looking at creating policies within vRealize operations. So I can apply a specific policy that maybe includes some compliance criteria, right? Maybe I don't want to evaluate the PCI benchmark against all of my vSphere clusters. Maybe I just want to evaluate against a select few clusters or maybe even some specific hosts. And that's really, where custom groups and policies can make vRealize operations a very powerful tool. Custom data centers are groupings of vSphere clusters to basically, create a custom data center. And this can be very useful for things like the workload optimization, where vRealize operations is going to look to balance workloads between clusters within a data center. Well, if we don't want workloads moving to a specific cluster, right, we can exclude that. We can create a custom data center that is just cluster A and B, but exclude cluster C. So vRealize operations isn't going to migrate workloads where we don't want them. Now, of course, there's a lot of options with workload optimization. And again, we're going to get into that in the upcoming module. Now, if vRealize operations is integrated with vRealize automation, then we can view all of the VRA cloud zones within here. We can also group virtual machines together to form applications. So if we are, say, trying to troubleshoot an application, well, we know all of the components that make it up. Say it's a 3-tier application where you have a web tier, database tier, and an application tier. Well, we can group all of those together to get a full picture of what's happening with that application. And then the last tab here is Inventory, and this is just where we can go to view everything in vRealize operations. And of course, depending upon which tab we select, obviously all of the objects will display in the pane below. And creating your own custom groups is very easy. Just by clicking the Add button here, we can just input some basic criteria, say for any virtual machine that starts with SQL. And of course, we can explicitly add or exclude objects from groups. And over here on the left, we can navigate through the various object types, and these are largely driven based on what management packs are installed in vRealize operations. So these are what provides all the extensibility for us to connect to a lot of various endpoints. And here we can see what this looks like. I've selected my vSphere hosts and clusters, and you'll notice this has a folder type structure very similar to what you would see in something like vCenter, right? Where we have our vSphere world, which is basically all of our vCenters that vRealize operations is connected to, and then each of the vCenters from there, the data center and the clusters, the hosts, virtual machines, resource pools, all of that sort of stuff. So that's how things are laid out once you pop open one of these various object types that we just saw. So here I have a vSphere cluster selected, and we're looking at the summary page for this cluster here. One of the biggest elements that we have on the summary page is the capacity remaining. Right? It's one of the most obvious things that we can see on this, and obviously that's because this is very important. And vRealize operations is calculating how much time is remaining. So we're looking at past deployments and what the growth is as far as virtual machines and workloads on this cluster, and we're charting that out over time. So we've got 42% capacity remaining, and this is showing the most constrained resource too, so memory, 42% remaining, but that also gives us over a year's worth of capacity. So great stuff to know, so we can do some planning if we need to, say, purchase more hardware or do some reclamation activities. We also show any active alerts that are related to this cluster and their various severities, and also utilization information and performance information, all on this one page. And this will change a little bit depending upon what type of object you select, but for the most part, this is the information that we show on the summary page. Also, across the top here are a bunch of various options. So obviously we're on the summary page, summary tab here. Next would be the alerts. So this is very much like the main alerts tab within vRealize operations, but just for alerts related to this cluster. Metrics is a cool tab because this is obviously where we go to view all of the metrics for, in this case, this cluster, but also it gives us a relationship view, so we can see all of the parent and child objects related to this cluster, and we can drill down all the way to the virtual machines, the data stores, the applications, right? We can dive pretty deep in the metrics view and view the metrics for all of these objects. So we're going to go deeper into that in a little while because there's just so much in the metrics tab. The capacity tab will show us information similar to what was on the summary page as far as time remaining, capacity remaining, but lets us dive a lot deeper and actually see how much capacity we have for each of CPU, memory, and disk space, as well as actually get some visualizations into the, how vRealize operations is calculating this capacity remaining. The compliance tab allows us to check, obviously, the compliance posture of the selected object. And in this case, we actually don't do compliance at the cluster level. We're looking at the configuration of each of the ESXi hosts, virtual machines, but there's really no configuration for the cluster that's related to compliance. So that's grayed out here. And then the logs tab is pretty cool because when we integrate vRealize operations with vRealize Log Insight, this is where we can go, and vRealize operations will actually launch vRealize Log Insight within a frame here within this window. And what's really cool about it is that it's going to pre-build a query in vRealize Log Insight. So here we have, again, the vSphere cluster selected. Well, if we go into that logs tab, vRealize Log Insight will show us the logs for that cluster. So that query gets pre-built depending upon what object we have selected here. The Events tab lets us look at changes to the object over time. So things like alerts being triggered, right? We can see a timeline of when various symptoms were reached and when alerts were triggered and things like that to really kind of build a story specifically around alerts, really. That's kind of where this is the most useful, is if we have an alert triggered on an object, well, we can see, again, over time, sort of what transpired or what happened to cause that alert. And then finally, under More, these are less commonly used features, but we can get details about the selected objects. We can actually run views against that object, sort of in a one-off type of scenario. And views are really, think of them as a single element of a dashboard, for example. And we can also view and launch reports for the selected object under here as well. And so that takes us to the end of this module, which was, again, just a really quick overview of the vRealize operations UI and how to basically navigate through the product. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you in the next section.